Today I'm going to be talking about the history of Armenian peace and conflict throughout the centuries, beginning all the way back before 1450. First, here are my research questions. My first research question was, how does the Armenian genocide affect Armenia today? My second question was, what consequences were there for those who inflicted the genocide? And finally, what caused Armenians to be outcasts from the rest of society? Now, here's some background information about Armenia. Armenia has a history dating back approximately 3,500 years, making Armenia one of the top 10 oldest countries in the world. From the time of Armenian foundation in the 11th century BC until Cilician Armenia's takeover by Egypt around 1400 AD, Armenian people endured many attacks and battles in an attempt to maintain their semi-independence. Prior to Turkish rule of Armenia, which began shortly after 1400, Armenia had endured 4 kingdoms over the years, each kingdom representing a phase of Armenian leaders. The first Armenian kingdom was the Artashisan dynasty, which lasted from approximately 200 BC to 150 AD. The second dynasty to rule Armenia was the Arshakunian dynasty, which formed in the middle of the 2nd century AD. This kingdom was related to the royal family of Persia, which allowed for a very good relationship between the two countries. This allowed for a relatively long period of peace and cooperation between the countries. However, soon the ruling dynasty of Persia was overthrown, leading to conflict between Armenia and the new rulers of Persia, the Sassanid dynasty. Because of this, they started to follow an anti-Armenian policy, basically attempting to assimilate the Armenian population. In their attempts at an anti-Armenian policy, the Sassanid dynasty attempted to gain advantage from the closeness of the two groups' religions, as they both practiced religions similar to Zoroastrianism, which resulted in Armenia declaring their state religion as Christianity. This led to Armenia being the first Christian state in the world. Between the time of the 2nd and 3rd dynasties, Armenia was juggled around by Sassanid Persia and the Byzantine Empire. The Sassanids attempted to convert Armenians to their religion, Zoroastrianism, but the Armenians fought back and, though it resulted in the death of their own king, were able to fight against Persia and maintain their religion, as well as gain more autonomy and independence from Persia. By the year of 634, Armenia was pretty much independent. However, at this point the Arabs began invading Persia, leading to the conquering of Armenia in 654. After more than 2 centuries of conflict and discontentment with the Arab rule, Armenia re-established their independence in 886. This led to the 3rd Armenian dynasty, the Bagratunian dynasty, ruled by Ashot Bagratuni. During that time, Armenia reached its peak in social, political, and cultural development, and the architecture during this period severely influenced European architectural styles. Near the end of the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire decided to attempt to weaken Armenia, and eventually annexed it in 1045. During this annexation, a few Armenian princes were able to escape the country and find refuge in Cilicia, where Armenians took up the majority of the population. Their leader, Prince Reuben, developed a new Cilician kingdom, which allowed the area to become known as Cilician Armenia or Little Armenia. This was called the Rubenian dynasty and was the 4th and final Armenian kingdom before the Turkish rule of Armenia. This kingdom of Armenia was actually able to survive for about 3 centuries, throughout that time enduring many attacks from Turks, Mongols, Egyptians, and Byzantines. Eventually, around the year 1400, Armenia fell to Egyptian Mamluks. After this, the original Armenian homeland was divided between the Ottoman Empire, Western Armenia, and Persia, Eastern Armenia. Even so, many Armenian principalities were able to maintain their semi-independence, and Armenia was still able to develop their identity despite foreign rule. Throughout the period between about 1400 and the end of the 1800s, Armenians lived relatively peacefully under the rule of Persia and the Ottoman Empire, and were granted a high level of autonomy. However, as Armenians were strictly a Christian group, they faced a high level of discrimination from the Muslim social system within the empire. When Armenians began fighting for more rights in the 1800s, the empire immediately turned against them, leading to the Armenian Hamidian massacres of 1894 and 1896, in the Armenian Genocide, which occurred between 1915 and 1917. When Armenians began to demand more rights from the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Abdülhamid II, the leader at the time, did the exact opposite and organized massacres against the Armenians. Throughout the 2 years in which these massacres occurred, anywhere between 80,000 and 300,000 Armenians were murdered. These massacres became known as the Hamidian Massacres and gave Sultan Abdülhamid II the title of the Bloody Sultan. These massacres were only the beginning of the extreme violence that Armenians faced. In July 1908, Sultan Abdülhamid II was overthrown and the Young Turks took over. The leaders of the Young Turks were Mehmed Talat, Ismail Enver, and Ahmed Jamal. When this overthrow took place, Armenians believed this would be a turning point for their people and that their second-class status would no longer remain. For some time, they were allowed to think this, until 1909, when the next massacre occurred. Previous supporters of Abdülhamid II staged a revolt, but instead of going after the new government, they turned against the Armenians once again. This massacre took place in the city of Adana, which was formerly part of the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia. 30,000 Armenians were mercilessly murdered. When the Young Turks got the empire back in order, Armenians thought that they would make things better. However, the Young Turks had a very different idea. They decided that the only way to present a united front was through a process called Turkification. This meant that anyone who was not Turkish, the Armenians, were a direct threat to the country. At the beginning of World War I, the Young Turks became suspicious that the Armenians were rooting for the other side in hopes of gaining independence. Because of this, the battle against Armenians intensified, and the Ottomans declared a holy war against all Christians aside from their allies. On April 24, 1915, the Armenian Genocide officially commenced, with the arrest and execution of hundreds of Armenian intellectuals. Soon, regular Armenians were banished from their homes and sent through the Mesopotamian desert on death marches. The Young Turks organized killing squads, designed for the liquidation of Christian elements. Muslim people were allowed to move into the homes of Armenians who had been killed, and were able to seize their property without question. The official dates of the Armenian Genocide are from 1915 to 1917, but the killings and mistreatment continued all the way into the 1920s. At the end of World War I, many Turks were arrested and sentenced to death for their war crimes, while the Young Turks were able to flee from Turkey before getting caught. However, a group of Armenians were able to track them down and seek revenge. Though different sources vary, it is estimated that during this 2-year genocide, more than 1 million Armenians were murdered. Ever since this event, Turkey has resisted admitting that the tragedy actually occurred on their terms, and still to this day deny that the Armenian Genocide even happened. After the genocide, many traditional homelands for Armenians were left without Armenians, and the majority of the remaining population dispersed worldwide. There are an estimated 9 million Armenians in the world today, and only about 3 million of them actually live in present-day Armenia. Since the genocide, Armenians have regained their rights and have faced no further major conflict. Even so, they are still fighting for an apology from Turkey, and do not plan on letting the world, let alone Turkey, forget about the tragedy that their people were put through many years ago.